Today on Stronger Than Reason, we dip back into KMFDM with their 1995 crossover hit, Nihil. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. That was some good maple syrup. So let's talk about writer's block. The tyranny of the blank page. And we've all been there, right? Whether you felt it in school the night before your essay was due, or at work the night before a big presentation, or, anytime you have a minute to yourself and have every intention of being creative, and you sit down with all the hope in the world and all this promise, only for nothing. There's just nothing there. The well is dry, and it's a feeling of frustration for sure. Kind of feels like you're trying to carve a beautiful jack-o'-lantern with a big old teaspoon. You can't just seem to make any progress without tremendous effort. You can't just get inside this thing. It's just not working. Every attempt just gets pushed aside. Maybe you get something down and find yourself crumpling it up 30 minutes later. Half an hour wasted. Or maybe you make a little progress to find the result really uninspired and forced, just not living up to your expectations, and certainly not worth the amount of effort you made struggling to even make that much progress. Now, for sure, this is a normal human thing. Even the most prolific artists suffer from bouts of being uninspired. And in past episodes, we've talked about mitigating this effect by switching your attitude around, by just doing the work day in and day out and not worrying at all about how good it is. Did you get your 2,000 words in? If not, well, get to it. Don't worry about that Pulitzer Prize. Just get the 2,000 words on paper. Or did you get that rhythm track down? If not, get to it. Don't worry if it stacks up to every other track you've ever made. So whatever your gig, sometimes you just have to put in the time as a matter of self-discipline. In fact, the end result matters less than the simple act of doing the work. In time, for sure, the pendulum will swing back and you'll find yourself in that happy flow state again, doing great stuff. But discipline takes you so far. Sometimes what you need is a good diversion, something else to focus your mind on, to get your thought patterns out of whatever rut you find yourself in. Just start some other project, or go for a walk, or spend some time with family and friends. Because when you're grinding your gears, it's sometimes good to disengage the clutch, if that analogy still makes any sense in a world where almost no one drives a stick anymore. But for sure, I've talked about some prolific musical artists on here, like Jandek in episode 64. We really dug into that topic of creative self-discipline. But another band I've talked about repeatedly is also very prolific, and I think so far I've covered 4 of their albums, and that's 4 out of 23 and counting. So I'm getting a lot of mileage out of them for sure, with a long way yet to go. And the band, as you may have guessed, is that mainstay of industrial rock, KMFDM. And in 1995, they were stuck in something like a creative rut themselves. The early 90s were a very turbulent time for that band, and if you recall way back in episode 6, we talked about their 1992 album, Money, and how it came about despite the band nearly dissolving. Well, they persisted into the following year by becoming more of a rock band, writing and touring with a bevy of metal guitarists to support their album Angst, which achieved maybe their most commercial success to date. But how would they follow that up? So after the Angstfest tour, each member of the core band moved from Chicago to a different part of North America. Vocalist and multi-instrumentalist N. Esch moved to New Orleans, maybe the only city on the planet where he would fit in. Guitarist Gunter Schultz moved to British Columbia, the jewel of Western Canada. And main man Sasha Konietzko, perhaps following the trends of the day, moved to Seattle and likely used slow modems there. So lines of communication were frayed at best. Sasha found himself with just one song that he liked, one called Trust, an early version of which appeared as a B-side on the Glory single, which I'm sure you recall was the fourth and final single from Angst. Sasha was inspired to do something, to make music, but he was frustrated by writer's block. Normally, he was very prolific and just full of ideas, but nothing flowed, nothing felt good, and he couldn't penetrate the problem. There just seemed to be no way in. So he fell back on the tried and true remedy, just doing the work. So he performed a necromantic ritual. I think it involved a pentagram with Ritchie Blackmore's picture in the middle to summon Gunter to Seattle, along with longtime KMFDM vocalist Dorona Alberti. And they convened at Bad Animals Studio, which was then owned by Ann and Nancy Wilson of Heart, which is really cool. The only song that fell out of that session was a chunky, blistering tune that would eventually appear on the final album as Brute, about which we will speak more in due time. But Sasha wasn't happy. Nothing they put down clicked. It didn't sound to him like the next iteration of KMFDM. The project just wasn't growing. So sometimes you also need a bit of serendipity, and it arrived in this situation, unlooked for, in the form of a phone call from a guy named Raymond Watts, an Englishman who was a former member of the band back in the days of their first proper albums, What Do You Know, Dutchland and Don't Blow Your Top, after which he had left to form his own symphonic industrial band called Pig, which had gone on to some success, having 3 full-length albums out on Wax Trax by this point. Now, these two fellas hadn't spoken at all in something like 7 years. It turns out Raymond had just called out of the blue to see if Sasha wanted to collaborate on a project, and as it turns out, he did. So they spent a few days in Seattle recording a 5-track EP that would appear in December 94 as Sin, Sex, and Salvation under the moniker KMFDM versus Pig. And I have a very strong memory of stumbling upon this record in the KMFDM section of my local music mart and being somewhat baffled by it because it was the first Versus album I had ever come across. So I didn't snap it up right away. I would wait a few years to get the MP3 version on my iPod, but once I heard it, I realized how it had heralded the next chapter of KMFDM. Any of these songs on this EP could have easily fit on the next album, especially the opener, Secret Skin. So as far as Sasha was concerned, this project was the breath of fresh air he desperately needed, the shot in the arm, the kick in the ass, the spark for his inspiration. So he invited Raymond to pitch in on the KMFDM album, and Raymond agreed. And bringing Raymond in was sort of like when George Harrison invited Billy Preston to sit in with the Beatles. He was a catalyst and sort of a key that unlocked the band and let them level up. So who else was involved with this record? Of course, the core team was still Sasha with Gunter and Enesh, and they had brought in Raymond. Chris Shepard was their engineer, but he also did a bit of writing. And former Ministry guitarist Mark Durante helped write a couple of songs too. And this being KMFDM, they had to have a strong female vocalist, and in this case they had two, the longtime contributor Dorona Alberti and newcomer Jennifer Ginsberg. Bill Rieflin of Ministry and Revco played some drums, which would continue his long association with the band. And finally, Sasha apparently had a bit of extra cash, so he took the opportunity to hire a 3-piece horn section for one track. But we'll talk about that more in a bit. Personally, I think it was money well spent. So they all reconvened in Seattle in late 94, and thus the next album was born. And it would turn out to be KMFDM's most commercially successful album to date, if not the most critically acclaimed. I think the latter will probably always fall to Naive. See episode 38 for a lot more on that, and why that album is so beloved by fans. But this would be a close second because of its crossover appeal and the inclusion of a key track on the Mortal Kombat soundtrack. And that would introduce the band to a slew of new listeners. In all, I think it's a skillful blend of rock, pop, electronics, and just downright crunch. The album, of course, is Nihil. let me talk about first hearing Nihil. So this came out in the spring of 95, and for me, that was the tail end of my college experience. I had more or less mentally checked out of college at that point and was thinking ahead, like, what was I going to do with my summer, the rest of my year, the rest of my life? But before I left town, I did hit my favorite used record store one more time, and lo, there was this copy of the Nihil CD in the K-bin as if it were waiting for me. And this being the brand new KMFDM, I snapped it up for just $7. Quite a bargain. Turns out it was an advance promo copy, which the store had zero compunction about selling, despite the stamp on many covers saying, for promotional use only, not for resale. As a poor college student, I can't say I had any issues about picking these things up for cheap. The downside is that Nihil was the first KMFDM album to come out with something other than a single panel sleeve. It actually had a booklet with lyrics and production credits, and I didn't get any of that. I just did get the single panel sleeve here, nothing even on the back. If you can look close, you can see the track names printed in teeny weeny eye strain O-vision here along the one side. The CD itself, as far as I can tell, looks like every other CD, though. It looks pretty normal. The back insert, though, is its own story because this CD didn't come with a back insert. The one you see here, I printed on my dorm's fancy new laser printers. I can't even remember how I did it. It must have been some graphics program. I guess I measured out the size of the tray. And, I even did the spine here, which is not bad. This green here is actually a green highlighter. And, I remember being pretty proud of my little arts and crafts project and, telling an acquaintance about it, only for him to give me crap about how you got to buy the real version to support the artist, man. And, fair point, right? Yeah, but I had no money. I was a big fan, and, the thing was for sale there in the bin. Let's be real. If I hadn't bought it, someone else would have, very gladly. And, I wasn't about to get all indignant with the salespeople about how they were taking money away from artists. So, for the record, I've given KMFDM a silly amount of my own money over the years, buying their new records in multiple formats. So, I really don't feel bad at all about picking this one up used. The album was really the soundtrack to the rest of my year. As it turned out, I would move home and spend the summer sending out about 1 million resumes. And I fully expected to get a job in the big city where I went to school, but that didn't happen. I ended up going in a completely unexpected direction, literally just the opposite direction on the compass, and ended up settling quite far away where I still am. And it's weird because it was such a random thing. It was just me following a classified ad in a newspaper. Do you remember those? Scanning through all that tiny print. Thinking back, it's hard for me to believe that this company bothered to run an ad for this entry-level position so far away from my hometown. But they did, and I called. I ended up getting the job and packing up my meager possessions. See, kids, back in those days, you could actually get an entry-level job and afford a place to live. I had a little efficiency in a very small downtown area. It turned out to be chock full of roaches, but I wouldn't discover that until I was about to move out about 11 months later. But generally, it was an okay place to live, and for sure, my new neighbors got to hear their fill of Nihil. So that's enough with the history lesson. What were my initial impressions of this record? I admit I didn't immediately warm to it as I had with Money and Angst. It struck me as being a bit poppier, maybe a bit more mainstream, maybe a bit less industrial, although the production was outstanding. I thought it was way better than the previous albums, which were landmark albums, but compared to some of the records coming out at the time, I thought they sounded kind of thin. Nihil, on the other hand, really popped. And maybe it had something to do with the impending loudness wars. I don't know, but the mix just sounded outstanding. It had crisp highs, it had very deep bass, it had sounds bouncing all around the stereo field. It was like a feast for headphones. And there were more kinds of sounds here, beats and guitars, of course, but quite a bit more synth and angst. The horn section, there were more moods, there were slower songs, there were faster songs, and most of all, some really fantastic vocals. I thought Raymond Watts added a lot. His voice, as I think I've mentioned before, is not really unlike Douglas McCarthy's of Nights of Reb. Just a powerful kind of growl. Of course, the breakaway hit here was the track Juke Joint Jezebel, but it didn't really do much for me compared to some of the other songs. It's pretty much a straight dance rock track. At first, there was really just one song here that completely blew me away, like knocked me right out of my boots, and that was track 9, Brute. Again, we'll talk about it more in the track by track, but let's say for now that a lot of that love came down to Raymond's vocals because they were just outstanding, and I played that song over and over and over. But the first thing, the obvious thing looking at this, the thing that really stumped me was the artwork, because for the first time, the artwork was not by Aidan Hughes, a.k.a. Brute, no relation to the song. I mean, there had been something like 24 KMFDM releases by this point, and singles and albums, and every one had the same basic design. You got your KMFDM at the top, you got your title at the bottom, and you have Brute's art in between. And that's one thing that made collecting KMFDM records so much fun, because it was like an ever-expanding box set. Everything just kind of looked the same. So just to give you an example, here's a couple of the singles from this album, which we're going to talk about in a bit. Both feature the very standard Brute artwork, which is super distinctive. But, here on Nihil, we have something completely different, an oil painting. And it turns out that Brute was AWOL when the time came around to do the album art. No one had any idea where he was or how to contact him, so Sasha had to scramble for a plan B. Fortunately, he remembered some very cool paintings by Francesca Sundsten, and he was familiar with her work through her husband, Bill Rieflin, who of course was in Ministry and who contributed drums to Nihil. Bill would be a regular KMFDM contributor in the late 90s and early 2000s. So Francesca contributed this piece, which I will describe for those listening on the podcast or who aren't familiar with it. It's a somewhat surreal portrait of a woman, kind of a remix, if you will, of the Mona Lisa. I think the composition and colors are actually quite similar. She is staring directly into the camera. No enigmatic smile here, though. She doesn't look extremely happy. There's a bee hovering over her head, and there is a lush landscape in the background with a volcano blowing smoke on the horizon. This is unique in the KMFDM catalog in that it is a full-color picture. There is the compilation album A Go-Go, which has non-Brute art, but that cover is a lot more graphic than this. And then there's the supposed prequel album Opium that has a couple photos in limited color. But, this cover is special. It's a full-color oil painting. And I'm sure some of you know that, unfortunately, Francesca passed away in 2019, and Bill passed a few months later. Both hadn't even lived to see their 60th birthdays, and they were incredibly talented people. They went way too soon, and all I can say is cancer. But I encourage you to check out more of Francesca's work. A lot of it is on the internet, and much of it is reminiscent of this cover. She definitely had her own unique style. I do remember seeing this for the first time and just being really surprised and thinking, maybe that's it with Brute. What's next? Is KMFDM going to start putting Sasha's face on their covers? But needless to say, someone found Brute by this time, and the Nihil singles came out, and Brute's been more or less with them ever since. So Nihil remains something of an oddity. But what was my reaction to listening to this for the first time? To me, it sounded like KMFDM tarted up a bit. Angst, is pretty stripped back in terms of the sound palette. It was a lot of industrial beats, real sounding drums, bass, a lot of metal riffing, except for maybe the track No Peace, which had some killer Hammond B3. Nihil is a bit more stylistically adventurous. There's a bit more variation here. And like I mentioned, the mix is just a lot better. I sometimes think maybe I should go back and invest in the remastered versions of the earlier albums because I'm still rocking the originals. And like I said, the mixes are noticeably thin on some, like Money and Angst. But this copy of Nihil, right out of the gate, it sounded absolutely huge, blasting out of my little Panasonic stereo back in the day. When I turned that big goofy sub bass knob up on this album, it actually did something. So, back in 95, I was mostly interested in KMFDM for their beats. I wanted hard grooves, beats, and bass lines. Sasha was brilliant at all of these. He would routinely fill singles with an album's worth of killer remixes, as I've discussed ad nauseum here. With few exceptions, his singles had little filler. At least one track on each would tend to blow me away. So I was kind of bummed that he sort of gave up on making regular singles in the 2000s. But, I suppose it wasn't realistic to expect him to keep up that level of activity forever. But sure, there were a few tracks on Nihil that fit that bill, delivering what I think of as that pure KMFDM, the ultra heavy beat. I remember Sasha saying in one old interview, and I forget where, that a KMFDM song is essentially just a beat and a bass line. Everything else is just stuff thrown on top. I guess like your chives and bacon on a baked potato. With this band, it was all about the rhythm section, and that's why they called it the ultra heavy beat. I think Nihil is the first album where he started to get maybe a little more experimental, to stretch a bit. The arrangements for sure are a bit poppier. Naive, Money, Angst, all classic albums, but they never really strayed too far from what was becoming the KMFDM formula, and Nihil changed that a bit. And, with a bit of canny marketing, it broke KMFDM through into the mainstream in a way that hadn't ever happened before. Also, I have to say that Nihil has a real album feel. It's not just a collection of songs. If you listen to it in sequence, it plays well as a full listening experience, end to end. There, like I said, they're faster songs, slower songs, a variety of styles. And I think that wasn't always the case with KMFDM's earlier albums. So with all that said, let's get into the track by track. Things start right off with Ultra. It's got a bunch of banging metal to remind you that you're listening to an industrial album. And then, one of KMFDM's patented double-layered beats comes in. First with just a straightforward boom bap, and then a fast double-time country beat. And talking about that, it seems like that shouldn't work, but it actually does, because that second beat comes in and just propels the song right along very nicely. And then you have some really sweet slide guitar, which I'm pretty sure is from Mark Durante, and just great verse vocals from Raymond. This song at once tells you what KMFDM is all about, but also sounds more professional and complete than anything that came before. It sounds to me like Sasha and Enesh are helping out sing the chorus, and Gunter has this totally face-melting solo at the end. And, that's what a lead-off track is supposed to do. It's kind of supposed to encapsulate the whole album. It's supposed to draw you in, and this track, Ultra, does that beautifully. And I can remember my first listen and thinking, wow, damn, that is some heavy stuff, because it was impressive. It wasn't just generic riffing to beats. This is like a properly put together song. The slide guitar in particular, it's like providing that creamy goodness, and it keeps this from being just another KMFDM by the numbers. So it was unexpected, and it kind of knocked my expectations out of whack. So really good stuff. One other thing I should point out, I'm not so much into anime, but I didn't realize until recently that a lot of people associate this song with a particular scene in the animated film Street Fighter II, which came out that same year in 1995. So yeah, just yet another way that the band found new fans at that time. So on to track 2, Juke Joint Jezebel, which of course would be the breakaway hit. It actually came out as a single twice, once before the album, backed by a B-side called Kraut, and later after the album, backed by a number of mixes by the legendary disco producer Giorgio Moroder. Sasha explained this as the record company putting out the first version without his approval. I didn't pick that one up, and in the end, I was vindicated because they came out with this second version here, and they put Kraut on the end of it. So there's no need for me to own the original. I mean, I am a KMFDM completist, but I'm also not an idiot. The original version looked like this one, except it was basically red instead of purple. Kraut itself is more or less a cover of another album track on here, Disobedience, except with German vocals. I have no idea if they've just translated the Disobedience lyrics or what, because I don't speak German, and to my knowledge, Sasha hasn't published the lyrics for Kraut. But on to the main event here, Juke Joint Jezebel. This is, I gotta say, a pretty standard KMFDM heavy dance tune, but with a few twists. My first impression was that it was quite poppy, with Dorona Alberti just killing it in the very sing-along chorus, backed by what sounded almost like a gospel choir, but I guess in fact was just Sasha, N, and Gunther multi-tracking their backup vocals, which was pretty clever. Raymond once again leads the verse vocals and is just as expressive as ever, just growling and sputtering his way through these lines. And the tune has a big 4-on-the-floor beat. It's really emphasized by Gunther's killer rhythm guitar work. And again, like Ultra, this song is kind of a microcosm of the whole album. So in that way, the two are kind of like a 1-2 punch, just a very strong intro. I would hazard to guess that most people know this song through its inclusion in the soundtrack to the 1995 live-action film Mortal Kombat, which of course was based on the popular arcade game. What is it with all these film adaptations of fighting games? Like, was that stuff really that compelling? I guess, watching people kick the shit out of each other never goes out of style. But unlike the Street Fighter movie, I actually did pay cash money back in the day to go with my friends to see Mortal Kombat, and I never played the game growing up. So to the extent any of us tried to follow the nearly non-existent plot, it was pretty confusing. But mostly we were there for the fighting scenes and, as it turned out, the really bitchin' soundtrack. And I don't have any memory of where this song appeared in the film. I know that they did use Giorgio Moroder's Metropolis mix for the movie, which of course is a bit bubblier than the album version. Overall, though, I gotta say, not really a fan of Giorgio's mixes. Sorry, Giorgio. I think it's just hard to improve on the original in this case. But there were a couple of videos for this tune. If I recall, one was all anime, some other anime, I don't know what it was. And the other featured clips from Mortal Kombat and the band playing the song. And that was a bit confusing with all this anime. I didn't know what went with what. But, by that point in 95, I wasn't really watching MTV anymore, except for maybe Beavis and Butthead. And, the only KMFDM song they ever played was A Drug Against War. Anyway, it's a good song, though one I would get a bit tired of. They actually did release a third version of this song, a double A-side with Trust. I remember seeing that in the store and being pretty confused. Like, do we really need 3 versions of this single? First of all, it kind of cheaped out, but because they did another palette swap for the art. This time they palette swapped the art for Brute, which had come out a little earlier, and about which we'll talk about in a bit, trust me. And track-wise, they mashed up the Old Glory single from Angst and pretty much added the album version of Trust and the Metropolis mix of Juke Joint Jezebel. So, what was the point? At best, it was a blatant cash grab from the record company, and at worst, it was the band itself putting out some super low effort releases, which I don't think was the case, but I guess it depends on who you trust, so to speak. Anyway, that was Juke Joint Jezebel. Track 3 is Flesh. This is one of the 2 metal-ish songs on the album, along with Search and Destroy. Flesh has very few synths and keyboards. It's mostly just drums and guitar. But if you listen really carefully, like I do, you can hear the drums from Vogue underneath it all. See, it's even more conceptual continuity, which we talked a lot about in all the previous KMFDM episodes. But this song is one of my favorites on the album. I really love the double kick drum, the cool vocals. It's a hard song, but the chorus is really catchy, and it really raises it above just being a generic metal song. And there is a cool live version of this track performed on the Beat by Beat by Beat video, all of which is now on YouTube these days if you don't have it. This video came out in 97, if I recall, and included a lot of tour footage from the Nihil tour and really emphasized the material on that album. And I think it shows the band more or less at their live peak with a very full lineup. Sasha, Gunter, End, Raymond, a bunch of others. It was a pretty formidable live show, and I think they were at the time maybe using fewer backing tracks just because they had so many people on stage. And of course, at that time they're all still young and vital and at their freaky best. It's definitely worth checking this video out if you like Nihil but haven't watched it, because it really brings these tunes alive. I've said it many times, but I'll say it again. I think 90s KMFDM was peak KMFDM, and this video is the best evidence of that. So let's move smartly along to track 4, which is Beast. This was an early favorite of mine because it's very much a classic style KMFDM track, just a huge beat and a bass line, though quite catchy. Again, most of these songs have a pop edge that the previous albums lacked. This is a very listener-friendly song. I think it's capable of swaying people who weren't necessarily familiar with KMFDM. It's a bit more techno than the other tracks, which I liked personally. And I do like its callback to the lyrics for Kickin' Ass that shows up towards the end of the song. Of course, Raymond sang on the original Kickin' Ass on the first proper album, What Do You Know, Dutchland? So that's a nice bit of fan service. What else about Beast do I like? The organ is badass. I think the Cookie Monster vocals are neat. I don't really know who did them. I'm guessing Sasha, but you can't say for sure because the liner notes didn't really break it down to that level. But Beast is one of my favorites here for sure, maybe my second favorite. So next up is Terror, which is immediately recognizable due to its kind of weird throbbing industrial beat. This is one of 2 songs that has Sasha hollering stuff through a megaphone. Just great rhythm guitar here. The song is really inventive. It has its own sound. In my mind, it kind of harkens back to the sound of Liebeslide. It has that sort of feel. Just great gang vocals on the chorus. But, it didn't immediately jump out at me, but I liked it. And it definitely rewards multiple listens because there's a lot of little things going on rhythmically, samples and stuff, pretty subtly that kind of differentiate it. So Terror is a cool track, very much in keeping with the feel of the album. The thing that really hits me now, though, listening to it again these days, is how this song is still very much on point lyrically, nearly 30 years later. And, if anyone has any doubt about KMFDM's political leanings, I urge you to consider these lyrics. And I quote, "Day after day, innocent people are being deported, interrogated, and tortured, put through the 3rd degree. Fundamentalist forces are undermining the integrity of liberal and democratic political structures. Radical anarchists, fascists, and terrorists are responsible for the violence. Our societies are saturated with bloodlust, sensationalism, and violence as a result of alienation from one's self-reality. How much longer will we tolerate mass murder?" Does that sound familiar yet? He goes on, though, to strike a more hopeful note, maybe in the spirit of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and I quote, "Handcuffs and shackles won't frighten us. Neither cattle prod nor electrical whip will silence us. We shall use all peaceful means necessary to overcome tyranny, persist and march on. They can't use our shame against us. Regardless of race, social status, or gender, we're all affected." So there it is, folks, the truth right from Sasha's own mouth. Fact is, KMFDM has always been woke, long before the MAGA chuds stole it and turned it into an epithet. So this song, Terror, this is protest music for progressives, plain and simple, and I'm here for it. Track 6 is Search and Destroy. No, it's not a cover of the Stooges classic. This is the second speed metal song after Flesh. And, I sort of think of this alongside tracks like A Drug Against War, Son of a Gun, and Stray Bullet. It does have this weird little synth line that occurs from time to time, but basically it's a fast beat with metal guitar, and it's also the shortest song on this album at just 3.5 minutes, so it kind of comes and goes as sort of a transition between the first and second sides. Next up is a pretty unusual song, Disobedience. Unusual in that it's noticeably slower. It's kind of a groovy song rather than just your normal blast to the face. Honestly, this gives the album a much-needed breath after just so many balls-to-the-wall tracks. And Disobedience has Raymond handling lead vocals with Sasha once again hollering things through a megaphone, which actually is a lot less harsh than it sounds here. It's more or less just a filter for his voice. But this is a pretty melodic rock song, really. Not harsh at all. Maybe it's most notable for having KMFDM's first horn section. It was a 3-piece with a trombone, a trumpet, and a baritone sax. But it would not be the last time Sasha added horns, as we will see when we talk about the next album. So he must have been encouraged by using them here since he did it again. And in my opinion, they sound great. What is a horn really but a synth? And what is a synth really but a horn? And toward the end, there's even a horn solo. And that just goes to show that, KMFDM was trying new things. They weren't going to be easily pigeonholed. They could adapt their stuff and their identity to a variety of styles. And the next song, Revolution, reinforces that with its very classical music kind of intro that, of course, transforms into industrial metal. And this is N.Esh's time to shine on lead vocals with help from Dorona Alberti, who really was the quintessential KMFDM vocalist, I think, through the 90s, because she's just all over these classic albums, and her input just can't be overstated. She really set the bar pretty high for female vocalists in this band. And I kind of wonder what she's been up to since the millennium, once the band went away and the lineup changed. From what I can tell, she's kept a pretty low profile. If anybody knows, has any cool stuff she's done, please share. I should add that they did release a version of this song called Revolution 2 on the Brute single. It's a lot more subdued, more electronic, atmospheric, which I think contrasts nicely with this more guitar-driven album version. Again, Sasha is just a master of reinterpreting his songs. The remixes he did were almost always interesting. Definitely more hits than misses compared to most remixers. So that's enough foreplay. Let's just get down to it. My favorite of this bunch, Brute. This song, frankly, just blew me away when I first heard it. And what was it about this song exactly that just lifted it above all these other songs, which are also excellent? I think it was two things, really. I think one was Raymond's vocals, especially in the chorus, because they're completely hair-raising. Two, the amazing way the rhythm guitar interlocks perfectly with and emphasizes the beat. And I think of all the songs here, I think Brute is really the one that best illustrates why KMFDM are known as the purveyors of the ultra-heavy beat, because this song is the biggest headbanger here, for sure. I'm lying, though, because there are a couple other things I love about this song. I think the second to last chorus, where Raymond is just yelling, is completely awesome. And then that last chorus, where at the very last line, the instruments just stop so you can fully appreciate his insane growl. And not least that wicked outro jam. I mean, what a sick groove. I just want to hear a remix of that that's just playing that thing for like 20 minutes. Holy hell. It was just really amazing. If you haven't heard it in a while, go check it out. What a riff. And, Sasha had the good sense to just let that go for a minute or so to take the song out. Completely amazing. But Raymond, though, this guy has vocal skills that neither Sasha nor Enesh can really hope to match, because he can just do things with his voice that ordinary people can't do. He's super expressive. It's just a talent he has. And again, I think his voice is reminiscent of Douglas McCarthy's, and I say that in the best way as a compliment. If you go back and listen to Knights of Reb's Lightning Man, you'll hear a similarity to Brute. And I think Raymond was a pretty great frontman, too. He was engaging. He was interesting. You can see that in the Beat by Beat video. And, I saw that myself when I saw them play live in the Symbols tour. I think he easily could have fronted this band long term, just like he fronted his own band, Pig, which of course had considerable success over the years. But how this guy wasn't a bigger star back in the day is just beyond me, because he's kind of the full package. Frontman, singer, songwriter. He kind of did it all. He would come back to the KMFDM camp on and off over the coming decades, but he would not be a constant presence. He'd kind of always come in, do some stuff, and then leave to do his own thing. But I think, for sure, his contributions to this album were immense, beyond just being the spark that Sasha needed to break himself out of his rut. Anyway, if it's not clear by now, I love this song, Brute. It's easily one of my top 5 KMFDM tracks, so you can imagine how happy I was to see the Brute single on the shelf of my favorite record store in the fall of '95. That was how it used to be back in the day, folks. I'd keep regular tab on the new records coming out, visiting the store once or twice a week, and, I'd be rewarded now and then with regular releases by KMFDM and other bands. Unlike the other singles from this album, this one would feature new, unique art, at least until they would hack it for trust, and a new, unique color. And it would not have Juke Joint Jezebel anywhere on it. So finally, a real single. And it has 5 tracks. It has the original version of Brute. It has 3 remixes by Sasha going under his Son of a Gun moniker, and the aforementioned Revolution 2. The Kunst mix here really is just synthing up the song and just sort of saving the guitar for the chorus. I think the In Your Face mix is just that. It's kind of a slight rearrangement of the album version to emphasize the beat. And this Punch mix is your obligatory wacky mix that adds, of all things, Hawaiian guitar. It's basically the Kunst version with Hawaiian guitar. It's all kind of pretty silly, but all in all, a great single if you love this song as much as I do. That's Brute. And that takes us to the album closer, Trust. This is, like I mentioned, the oldest song here, recorded first. The rough mix appeared on the Glory single. And I think this song was very much in the style of Angst. It would have fit perfectly on that album. You have Darona's vocals. You have some very basic guitar riffing. You have the main vocals from Sasha. Not much new here sound-wise. It serves mostly as a tie to maybe all that came before. But the really interesting thing to me about this track is after a minute of silence, a completely different piece starts. And it's all industrial noise. It's very experimental. It goes on for about 2 minutes or so and kind of just peters out into random bleeps and bloops. And this was kind of the first time the band put an unnamed hidden track on an original album. But in the re-release, Sasha did give this track a separate name, and I think it's on a separate track on the CD. and he named it Nihil after the album. So I remember him getting asked about this hidden track back in the day, and he said that it was just kind of where his head was at the end of recording Nihil, just his desire to take the band in a completely different direction by putting something completely nuts at the end. So let's talk about that. What did happen next after this album? Well, for one thing, we didn't have to wait very long to find out because the band were on a creative high, and the next album followed very shortly. The thing was, with the whole presentation of Nihil, all the collaborators, all the live touring, it kind of started to seem as if KMFDM were becoming a proper band. You know, their sound was bigger, their shows were bigger, they were really rocking it out, they were getting more press, they were crossing over into the mainstream a bit, getting radio play and getting MTV play. So we all kind of figured that the next album would really break them through in a big way. They were poised, as we say. But amazingly, Sasha did indeed take a left turn. He more or less rejected that route. As it would turn out, the next album really wouldn't feature Enesh much at all. In fact, they wouldn't tour again until 1997, 2 albums later. And they'd more or less fade back into mainstream obscurity, once again reclaiming their title of Big Fish in a Small Pond. I think the next album, in my mind, would be no less amazing than Nihil in its own way. It's just very different in scope and tone. But, it proved that KMFDM were not one-trick ponies by any means. And despite all the accusations of them relying too hard on a formula, they could still surprise the fans. But that's a story for another time. So why do I love Nihil? To me, it hits that sweet spot of KMFDM's heyday, when they were at the top of their powers, the height of their game, when Sasha, N, and Gunter were getting along and each bringing their own unique talents and weirdness to the mix, and Sasha was pulling from a huge network of co-conspirators. The sounds here and the sights on the beat-by-beat video presented KMFDM as just being larger than life, really effortlessly blending electronics and rock, better than most bands of the era, for sure. And they blended it into a sound that was really hard-hitting, but it was also really palatable. I think this is kind of a gateway album, like bacon is the gateway meat. It's the thing that's going to introduce the band to new fans. And I remember even playing it for my wife back in the day, and she was not into industrial rock at all. Still isn't, but even she could see the appeal of songs like Juke Joint Jezebel or Disobedience. They were just cool rock songs. Very much in the style of the overdriven 90s, nothing too extreme for your average radio listener, but with a distinct alternative, an electronic edge, KMFDM's unique stamp, which is exactly why I love it. But also more than most KMFDM albums, it really reminds me of that time, maybe because it's not an album that I revisited much in coming years, preferring instead in my iPod days to just listen to a few songs now and then. So listening to this end to end these days really takes me back to hearing it for the first time. And I kind of remember exactly what was going on in my head, in my life, leaving school, moving, getting my first real job, meeting my wife, all good things as it turned out. So beyond the content, this record makes me feel good for that reason too. Strangely enough, though, I don't think any of my close friends were listening to much KMFDM by this point, other than maybe inadvertently hearing it on the Mortal Kombat soundtrack. And I don't think we talked much about this record at all. Maybe because at this point in our lives we weren't in great touch with each other, all having come through the other end of post-secondary education. I was in a different town, I was making new friends, and for sure none of them were listening to industrial music. So for me, this wasn't so much as a close friend kind of album, but I did share it with online friends in Rec Music Industrial and Rec Music KMFDM, where for sure we would geek out and obsess about it and talk about it in extreme, excruciating detail. So there's that good memory too. The memory of realizing that there was a bigger community out there to share this music with, and that I was a part of that community. Well, there you have it, folks. The album where KMFDM flirted most with mainstream success, 1995's Nihil, showing KMFDM bigger, badder, and bolder than they had ever been, and that's saying something. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast, the show that occasionally takes a long, unexpected break with no reason given. Maybe the reason was writer's block, sitting down and attempting to come up with something to talk about, but finding no way into the subject. In fact, I started down the road on 2 other episodes before settling on this one, so with luck I'll be able to build on those and get them out on something like a more regular schedule. But you just never know, though, because I, for one, am easily distracted. Casually so, if you know what I mean. As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay strong.